So we continue, and the next panel is about the future. It has the title, The Western Balkans and the European Union, What's Next? So looking into the future, and it's not me who will moderate, but it is Christian Hagemann. He's the Deputy Director of the Southeastern Europe Association. So in Germany, that's the Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft. And before he became at that, he took this job. He took a deep dive into the academia world, and he was a postdoc at the professorship of the policy analysis at the Bavarian School of Public Policy and at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Now he's with us, and he will moderate the discussion. I hand it over to you, Christian, please. It's your turn.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas. Welcome also from me and from the Southeast Europe Association. And like Tobias said earlier, this is the first in-person meeting we are part of since the beginning of the pandemic. So I'm especially happy that this can take place. And yeah, so far it feels really good to be back. And thank you very much to Thomas Müller-Färber and the Academy in Locum, and also to Tobias for making this happening here and being optimistic enough to try this out in a hybrid format. So welcome to all present here, and also for those who are bearing with us online. And I would like to start with introducing my panel for tonight. Originally, it was supposed to be 4 persons here discussing with us, but Josip Juratovic, who wanted to be present, is unfortunately ill, and all the best to Mr. Juratovic and for his recovery. And I will just welcome or introduce everyone in the order of the program. So welcome to Clive Rumbold, who joins us here as representative of the EU. He's a senior expert at the European External Action Services Western Balkan Division. Welcome to Brussels.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
And then I'm happy to welcome also Sibonida Kaczarska, who's an expert for the EU, and she's director of the European Policy Institute in Skopje. Hello to North Macedonia.
Hello, Christian, and thanks to the organizers for the invitation. I would have loved to be in Locum, but it is what it is.
And also hello to North Carolina this time. Yasmin Mujanovic, a political scientist and assistant professor at Elon University in the United States, whose book Hunger and Fury, The Crisis of Democracy in the Balkans has fueled debates on the development in the region recently. Hello to the US, Yasmin.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be a part of this event, and thank you once again to the organizers and all of my colleagues for trying to make it work.
Glad to have you here. So following the script of the panel, we will touch upon a broad range of issues concerning Europe at the moment, with a special focus on the EU-Western Balkan relationship during the first hour, and thereby start a debate on many issues that will be continued both later in the Q&A, which we will have after a short break for 45 minutes with the audience, and also continue to discuss in the following days. So after we heard the presentation by Florian Bieber earlier, and also preparing this earlier, I had the feeling that there are many gloomy perspectives these days, and especially related to the still pretty unclear pandemic situation and its outcomes, but also in general to the situation in the region. So for the start, I would rather like to take a different focus, more on the optimistic aspects, which are nevertheless there, and would like you to all to address briefly the same question in a short introduction round. So what do you think, what are developments in the Western Balkans you observe these days that make you actually believe in the region's European perspective, and how can these optimistic things you observe be further fostered? Yasmin, we can start with you. What do you think?
It's a good question. I'll forward my comment by just saying very quickly, and I think this is something that will unpackage all of us over the course of our discussion here, as well as with I'm sure the folks in the audience, and that's namely that I'm convinced that we are probably presently at the low point of prospects for European engagement and integration in the region, probably since 2003. So I think this is pretty much the bottom of the barrel right now. This is about as bad as it's ever been, and I don't think it's going to get better in the next decade, full stop. Now, where do I see positive, optimistic scenarios? And they do exist. I do think that ultimately the turn towards a kind of grassroots level civic mobilization that we've started seeing in various places across the region, sometimes unfortunately in reactionary ways, but sometimes I think in very progressive and democratically inclined ways. I think generally that turn towards civic and civil society mobilization is positive. We've obviously seen it in places like North Macedonia, arguably most successfully, but we've also seen it in places like Kosovo and Bosnia-Herzegovina. I think this has a tremendous potential for democratic transformation in the region. Again, I would caution us to acknowledge that it does have certain kind of unstable, dangerous elements to it. And in many ways, it is coming out of a place of desperation, a place of, or rather the belief that kind of traditional international, European, but also American forms of support for the region have largely evaporated, and that citizens in the region are essentially left to themselves to deal with increasingly illiberal and authoritarian tendencies by elites. But that is in some ways a part of a process of democratic maturation. But again, I think we're talking about a different timeline presently than we were talking about in years prior. And to my mind, the payoff of some of the things that we're talking about presently is not going to come to fruition until possibly as late as the 2030s. That's all I'll say for now, to leave time for my colleagues.
Thank you. So it's civic mobilization with caveats, one could probably say.
Yeah.
Simonida, what do you think?
Thank you. I would say that the new methodology that the EU proposed as to the accession negotiations with what is now North Macedonia and Albania gives us a possibility of a new start, and I think it's the last chance for us, going back to where Yasmin ended, that it might be the low point. I think it's the last chance for these two countries, and specifically North Macedonia, to start going upward. And I think that this is going to be a make it or break it situation, both for the European Union and for the region, because I think that if the example of North Macedonia does not show that the processes can work, I think will lead to broader disillusionment in the region. But I do think that there is an opening that we see at this point, specifically in relation to North Macedonia, given that all of the developments, given the recent elections in July, the formation of a new government in a fairly orderly manner, the continuous support that the public of this country has given to the process of European integration, for being in the waiting room of the EU for over a decade now and being a candidate for over 15 years. I think that in all of these circumstances, we do have a good test case to see if things can be moved forward. But they need to be moved forward in a quicker manner than what Yasmin mentioned in terms of the 2030s. Because I think that this opening will not last too long, because in the last couple of years, one of the main leitmotifs of when I speak has been that we need to see things moving in a lifetime, in a living person's lifetime. So I think that this opening is in the next couple of years, but let's see if both sides will grasp it.
Thank you, Simonida. So this is a very good point for Clive to say his positive point, because Simonida already said that it was related to the EU. So what do you think?
Thank you very much. Yes, and thank you, colleagues, also for what you put on the table here. I think we had, as you mentioned, quite a gloomy initial impulse from our first speaker. I would definitely like to see the glass as more half full. And I welcome the elements that colleagues on this panel have put out there. I think I would just like, I'll be brief, but I want to step back a little bit, because I think it's important to see this in the longer term strategic perspective. Where are we, and how did we get where we are in the Western Balkans? I mean, if we look at our policy towards the Western Balkans today, it's a hell of a long way from how we looked immediately following the conflict, where it was mostly a sort of essentially a humanitarian intervention. We've moved an awful long way from there to a point where now we see our interest in the Western Balkans as a shared interest. It's not that we are doing this because we somehow owe it to the Western Balkans or we're just being nice. We have a shared geopolitical interest in integrating the Western Balkans into the European Union. And that's a powerful part of what draws us together. That interest is because of something which is immutable, which is geography. Quite often, I think that, and I think Florian Bieber pointed to something correct here, which is that people in the European Union don't necessarily fully understand that shared interest in integrating the Western Balkans into the European Union. Because there's this perception that it's off to the edge, to the east somewhere, people probably might not be able to even put it on the map. I know that seems strange to those of us who work on the Western Balkans every day, but I think there is an issue of people understanding that the Western Balkans is not just off to the east somewhere, it's actually surrounded by current member states of the European Union. And our geopolitical interest, our economic interest, our security interest in that is deeply tied in to that geography. And so in some sense, that makes our process of drawing closer together an inevitable one. Now, that's not to minimize any of the difficulties that colleagues have spoken about. Yasmin, you mentioned some of the more difficult aspects of it. Florian Bieber went into a great deal of detail on that. But I think the fact that we share these interests, the fact that the Western Balkans is deeply integrated into the economy of the rest of Europe, the fact that we share these security interests means there's only one way forward, which is that integration. Now, it isn't a rapid process. Simonida, I think you pointed to something very important, that this has to happen in the lifetime of an individual. It has to seem realistic as a prospect, and that is absolutely vital. But fundamentally, the mechanism that we rely on politically when it comes to fomenting positive change, transformation, is saying, look, it's up to you. We deliver based on what you deliver. You move forward in the process only if you do deliver on certain things, which we have to make extremely clear, and we do through the regular reports and so forth, that we give about the country. So I think we give a very clear picture of what the countries need to do. And then it's for the countries to deliver. And the responsibility, therefore, is with the political leaderships in the countries. Now, looking ahead, now I've been a little bit lengthy about that, but I think it's important to put it into that framework. I think we've had recognition of that shared interest when we look at the 2018 strategy that the Commission put out on the Western Balkans. I think that was also part of the Sofia priority agenda. So that was agreed between all of the heads of state of the region and of the European Union. So a very strong political commitment there. And Simonida, you pointed also out the enhanced enlargement methodology as a way moving forward. I think that is very important. Florian had a, let's say, glass half empty look at that methodology, but I think it's important to examine, as the Commission did at the request of member states, the mechanisms that we use and see how we can tweak those, see how we can make them better, see how we can make the levers work more effectively to make positive change happen. That's happening. The Commission made that proposal. The member states said, yes, this is good, we want to do that. And in the discussion that's going on in the Council at the moment on the negotiating frameworks for Albania and North Macedonia, that is being put into action. So we have a very dynamic process of seeing how we can make best use of the leverage that we have for positive change to bring the region closer towards European standards and into the European Union. Now, I'm conscious that I'm taking a bit of time here, but I do want to have a look at the countries and see where we are on those countries, because I think that they are a clear demonstration that we have a positive forward dynamic here. Simonida pointed to North Macedonia and the decision to open accession negotiations. We have the same decision for Albania. We have Bosnia and Herzegovina, which now has a clear way forward with the opinion So we're not working in a void. We're engaging to help them, help the authorities to address the most fundamental questions they need to deal with to get closer to the European Union. Serbia and Montenegro both negotiating, so in the machinery and moving forward with those chapters. The list goes on. Thomas, I'm getting from your body language that I'm taking a little bit too much time, and I wanted to leave time for the questions and answers, so I'll leave it there. But there are examples across the region of positive dynamism.
Maybe just to jump in here, Clive, at this point, thank you all for these examples. I must say, when I thought about positive developments in the region, I especially also thought about the government changes and the opening they probably provide for the EU and for domestic reforms. And I had the feeling that during the last days, we often talked about the region in terms of the whole idea of stabilitocracy and meaning authoritarian government with an, at best, window-dressing European agenda. So the situation seems to be changing in some places. For example, in North Macedonia, that was already mentioned, for a brief period this year, also in Kosovo. We might even see changes now in Montenegro. So my first question would be for Clive. How can the EU better use the momentum of these incoming potential reform governments to re-engage them for the European agenda? To not let it look like the developments we've seen in other front-runner countries lately?
Well, I think first of all, let's have a word of caution there. I mean, elections take place, and then government coalitions are formed after that, based on political agreements between them. That's something which is a direct result of the democratic choice of the people, and it's not for us to prejudge whether there'll be a change of government or not in a particular country. Yeah? And I think that's important because it is about the ownership of the people. Ultimately, our leverage works because we are able to say, look, to the country, not to any particular political party, indeed not just to the government, but to the government and the opposition and the population of the country. Look, this is the agenda you need to address. If you do that, your country will move forward. Then it's the responsibility of the politicians to deliver to their electorates to move ahead. And they are judged harshly when they don't do that. So that mechanism fundamentally does work. And if you look at the progress that countries have made on key reforms, it's very largely because of the, if you like, the democratic pressure behind the European integration agenda and the changes that are needed for that make it happen. Let's take the example of Albania. Albania did the most fundamental judicial reform of the whole region. It was incredibly difficult. It's very hard to change a judiciary in a country. It's like changing the engine of a car while the car's still going down the road. It's extremely difficult, both politically, practically, constitutionally. It's a hard reform to do. It has big political costs because of the vested interests involved, but they still did it. And the reason they did it is because it was a condition for them to move forward for accession negotiations towards the European Union. Now, that's a very good example of the leverage working.
So you say it's not really a special approach, but rather the general EU offer on the plate.
I think it's making effective use of that offer, and that means engagement. I think, Yasmin, you mentioned the word engagement very prominently. Florian Bieber also did that. Engagement is vital. If the people of the Western Balkans don't think we're interested, if they think that it's just a dry, a theoretical framework, then you're right. Then things don't move ahead. It's when we are engaged, when we show in the Council, which we do, that the member states are behind this perspective, and then the decisions are made that back that up, like the decision on Albania and North Macedonia, then people understand, okay, it is actually real. But that does require political engagement. That is absolutely key. I think let's take a counter example. When former President Juncker said no enlargement for the next 5 years at the beginning of his term. Now, that was strictly speaking correct when he said it, because there was no partner in the Western Balkans that was going to move to join the European Union in that period, simply mechanically. It was not going to get to the stage of actually joining the European Union. However, it was interpreted politically as saying, wow, it's pretty much off the table. We're not going to move forward with that whole process, which was absolutely wrong. We did move forward with the process. But I want to go back to what Florian Bieber said in terms of public perception of the European Union in the region. He said that it was now back on its way up since that period. And he's right. And that's the reason. It's because we demonstrated that actually we mean it. And, you know, beyond some misunderstood rhetoric at that period, actually we are engaged. And we have this idea that there's a shared interest in moving ahead. So I think if people understand our engagement and we keep it up, then our tools do actually work, and experience has shown that they function.
So let's move this question directly to Simonida. Give us the view from North Macedonia on this. So Clive spoke about that countries need to deliver, but at the same time, of course, the European Union also needs to deliver. And give us probably your perspective of the developments in the EU after the decision not to open accession negotiations last year. So you already spoke about the new methodology, that you see it as a potentially promising attempt to increase the credibility and effectiveness of the accession process. What else could be done, and how do you see the developments from Skopje?
Thanks, Christian. I mean, going back like a year ago, the October non-decision was rather a blow to the country and a lot of the positive developments that happened from the perspective of the EU. And I think we also have to keep in mind that the lack of a decision in October 2019 did lead to the early elections, did lead to quiet limbo and a stalemate, leaving the country to be led by a caretaker government since January till now. Now, going back to the methodology, I had to single it out because I don't think that from the perspective of North Macedonia, I don't think we have a choice to view it as the methodology as a negative one. So we have to see the glass full. And I think that we've been the experts or the masterminds of seeing the glass half full after the very idiosyncratic process that the country has had. Now, the country has had instances when it delivered and it did not receive a response from the European Union because of an external issue. Let's say, however, we deal now with, however we treat from this perspective, the name dispute that did leave the country hanging in a limbo for a long time. But that's the past. Now, where we stand at this point is that we are awaiting for the discussions on the negotiations framework for the country, which, as we were informed by some of our officials, will start tomorrow in the various council bodies. What is exceptionally important is for this process to move forward quickly and to have an actual outcome, as I mentioned before, in terms of realistic happenings, to have the first intergovernmental conference, preferably in the term of the German presidency. I hope, and this is one of the elements at which the Macedonian public is mostly focused on, and I assume the state institutions as well. And I think that from our perspective, what needs to happen is for North Macedonia to stop simulating EU accession and actually get into the accession negotiations. Hopefully through an enhanced manner, something because something comparable to what was happening possibly between for the 2004-2007 entrance that did receive a lot of engagement, going back to the words that both of the other panelists used, on the side of the European institutions. But here I don't mean only on the side of the member states. Here we also see the directorates general to view their counterparts in the Macedonian institutions as possibly future EU officials or as officials of a future EU member state. Now, I'm partly a scholar of conditionality, and we tend to forget that the mechanism did operate on engaging and socializing the new entrants. So I think that besides the shared interest, there's also the mentorship moment of the new incoming states. Now, I would be amiss if I don't mention that North Macedonia, even by the standards of the Commission, has been very well aligned with the EU legislation, comparable to Serbia and Montenegro. So this, should give us a sort of a head start in the accession negotiations if we deliver also on our aspects. What we are concerned with is how some of the elements of the method of the new approach and the methodology will be transformed into the negotiations process, such as, for example, some of the new benchmarking on democratic institutions that we are still awaiting to see how this will play out. We think that if the EU, if the Commission felt that it's necessary to be there, then it should be there. But then we also need to be very clear on the precise benchmarking process that will follow. The other aspect that we are also possibly concerned with is also how will the enhanced role of the EU member states play out? Because while we are very well aware that this is a necessary element, we've felt it on our backs and everywhere, we also think that it could be also possibly, hopefully there won't be a lot of space to abuse it. And the last point is that I would like to mention is that we're also, everyone in the region is also waiting for the economic package that's supposed to be coming up. More because even now with the pandemic, even more so because we are faced with a situation in which the gap that this economic package was supposed to address might even widen. So the economic support that these countries are getting for the process is also one that we should not forget. And I think that I'll end there at this round.
Thank you. Yasmin, let's go a bit beyond the pure EU process. In your research, you focus on the potential of civil society and especially also young people to lead changes in the region. But what we see recently is that there are high levels of immigration from all countries of the region. So I'm wondering, will reform-oriented governments soon lose their reform constituencies? Because it's often the highly educated younger people who would engage politically potentially who leave.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very, very plausible scenario, unfortunately. I mean, I do want to kind of stress one thing, and I do think it's important in the context of the conversation that we're having right now. Mr. Rumbold said a couple moments ago, for instance, that what the EU has offered the region is clarity. And I think we have to be very honest and transparent about that. I mean, that's one of the things that absolutely the EU has not offered. I mean, that's at the heart of the contemporary crisis. I mean, and again, the most obvious example is the sudden change of the accession criteria. Now, mind you, I'm one of these people who thinks the accession criteria should have changed, but not in the way that it changed, which was to pull the rug not once but twice from underneath two states that, as we all admit, Albania and North Macedonia had made tremendous strides towards actual kind of EU criteria. And then on the flip side, you have a country like Serbia, whose democratic credentials and democratic capacities have been collapsing at an alarming rate and is essentially on the verge of a de facto autocracy at this point, which continues to open chapters, right? So there's a very fundamental disconnect between EU rhetoric and EU policy. And that actually matters when we're talking about reform constituencies and when we're talking about the problem of immigration, because, you know, people read the news, people follow the news, they see what's happening in front of their eyes, and they say, well, look, this doesn't make sense. I mean, I have the problem if I'm a local citizen that I know that there's a historic generational problem with illiberal tendencies, authoritarianism, kleptocracy, generations of people that were willing to wait those 15, 20, 25 years for things to get better. They've decided, okay, no, I'm not, I was willing to wait. I'm no longer willing to wait for my children. I want my children to have a better life right now. So I'm going to go to Germany, Sweden, Canada, the US, Australia, wherever. So they're just leaving. But at the same time, they've also increasingly become disillusioned with the international community, and in particular with the European Union, because they've concluded that they're just not good to their word, either because the whole process has become so convoluted and so incoherent, or in places, I think, like Bosnia in particular, but this is, I think, a regional phenomenon, EU officials are seen to be essentially handmaidens for the worst kind of authoritarian, illiberal, kleptocratic tendencies in the country, right? I mean, I'm not sort of going to go through the litany of reasons why people believe this. But, you know, we had an incident, for instance, very recently, just a couple of months ago, just before sort of the pandemic really kicked off, where, you know, you had a high level EU official in the country refer to one of the sort of most obvious recalcitrant, obstructionist, nationalist elements in the country, referring to him essentially as a champion of European values. And when you see something like that, and you're a citizen in Mostar or Banja Luka or Sarajevo, and you see that in the newspaper, you hear that on the television at night, you're thinking, boy, this, that is, wow, you are detached from reality. And so the obvious conclusion is that, again, you're going to leave. Now, as for what that means for, you know, reform potential, yeah, you're absolutely right that it does, you know, it does rob us of constituencies that are going to be most inclined for reform politics. But it also has to be said that it's not eliminating it completely, because you know, there's always going to be a batch of people that are going to stick around. The issue is what they then conclude once they've stuck around, because you have two essentially options from that point on. One is that those people are going to fall in line with the kind of patronage networks and the kleptocratic tendencies that exist in the country, because that's the only way to survive. So you have to play ball, as it were, if you want to make any kind of living. The other, I think, just as dangerous to my mind, though, scenario is that you're essentially going to start seeing a kind of progressive radicalization. And that process is already underway. This is why we have started seeing this turn towards street-based politics all over the region. Because people are concluding fundamentally that democratic institutions, as they have been shaped and created to date, are no longer able to deliver on their most basic aspirations, which is to say quality of life, accountability, transparency, some form of economic progress, if not equality, right? Those things appear to be out of seemingly the purview of the existing democratic establishment in the region. And as a result, you're seeing, on the one hand, you know, you're seeing political parties in the region starting to engage in more and more essentially radical stunts. I mean, this turn towards election boycotts, for instance, to me is incredibly destructive and alarming, although I understand where it comes from. On the other hand, you're seeing things play out, for instance, like we're seeing play out in Montenegro right now. I mean, I have to say, you know, to all of us who are watching it, this is not about Europe. It's not even about the United States. I mean, this is a fundamental schism within Montenegrin society. And those kinds of issues are coming back to the fore because that kind of European and international dimension is starting to matter less and less, because it just doesn't seem possible anymore. So you're starting to see these kinds of, shall we say, internal political questions, which have so far been suppressed, coming to the fore. You can see it in Serbia, you can see it in Kosovo, you can see it in Bosnia, et cetera, et cetera. So again, you know, I think it's a little bit to echo, I think, you know, Florian's points, which I think were very well taken. It's very difficult to kind of separate all of these issues from one another, because they're all increasingly becoming intertwined into a very, very dangerous spiral, unfortunately.
Thank you, Yasmin. And we'll move on to further issues, and I would like to remember the audience that you're free to write your potential questions into the Q&A field of the software, and we're going to address them in the Q&A session after the short break afterwards. So if you already typed them in, we will collect them and put them all to our panelists later. I would like to take a view also at the international level. And when we look there and what we've seen last week, the negotiations in Washington, or what has happened there, the European Union and the US were recently often at loggerheads when it comes to the Western Balkans. So with a low point, probably the fall of the Kurti government earlier this year. So this is a question to Clive Rumbold. What would you expect from a potential future Biden administration? If it should happen, and how could the additional weight of the US be used to foster also the European agenda?
Well, it's obviously not for me to talk about the current or future around administration in the run-up to an election. I think we have to respect other countries' electoral processes as well. And I think it's honestly not possible to enter into that now. I think what I can usefully talk about is how we work together with the United States. Now, clearly, there are issues on which coordination is extremely important, and that's sometimes work in progress. But fundamentally, I think what's important to keep bearing in mind is that we have shared interests again with the United States in the Western Balkans, because we are global actors based on democratic and human rights values. We have fundamentally similar positions, and we're trying to fundamentally do the same sorts of things. In the specific case of the Western Balkans, obviously we both have a strong interest in a stable and democratic Western Balkans that reflects our shared values, which means that in practice on the ground, we are working on the same things. We are trying to take forward rule of law, human rights, democracy, and support those. And when it comes to our work on the ground, we do it absolutely hand in hand with the US. I mean, I don't know how familiar colleagues are with the judicial reform process in Albania, to use that example again, because the reason I mention that is because the body that makes that possible which does the background work to help the vetting process, is actually a joint European Commission and US body. It's something that is set up between the two. And the political work to encourage Albania to make the fundamental changes that needed were again something that we worked on together with the embassy of the US in Tirana. So, and that's just one example. And we work in practice very, very closely also on rule of law issues across the region. And that's where I think both the US and the EU actually deploy a very significant proportion of the financial assistance that we deliver. So our work on the ground is closely hand in hand, and I believe that that's going to continue. Now, there's always work of coordination to do, and work of making sure that what we do on the ground works. That's something that we are going to continue to need to focus on.
So Clive already mentioned it, that there are other external actors around with whom the US and the European Union might not share the same values. But this question is actually for Simonida. Are you still there?
Yes, I had a minute when I was off.
Okay, because yes. I just couldn't see you. Yeah. So looking at these other external actors, mostly debated as the engagement of Russia, and especially China, has concerned a lot of people recently. And drawing on this, the Commission President von der Leyen and also Chancellor Angela Merkel have started to frame enlargement also as a geopolitical issue. And a lot of people have done this. And I must say that this also makes me concerned in a way, because the logic of geopolitics is entirely different from the logic of conditionality. So do you think that the rise of geopolitics potentially could mean a threat to conditionality? And how do you think this could be avoided?
You can hear me well, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that, because I missed. I had a minute when my internet was down, evidently. As you rightly noticed, geopolitics would be based on a different logic than conditionality. Now, whether they would be based on a mutually exclusive logic is a different question. And I think that in this scenario, also from where I come, I don't think we can view them as mutually exclusive. But I also don't think that you can base a successful enlargement process of actually building a member state purely on geopolitics. Because the underlying logic of conditionality has been to provide support and to provide carrots and sticks in exchange for a meaningful reform process, but also in the interest of the European Union member states. Now, the other issue is that we currently have member states that would find a huge proportion of the member states would find geopolitics more relevant than the conditionality argument. And there are member states that would consider that a rule of law conditionality would be more important than geopolitical matters, than relations with Russia or with China. Now, from where I stand, and I repeat this because I am in the Balkans, in Skopje, currently unable to travel to most of the EU member states, we do need to engage with both arguments. I don't think that we can just move one to the side and rely solely on one of them. And someone who's still a believer in the effectiveness of conditionality if all conditions are met, I think that the primary focus both of the EU member states, but also of the European Union institutions, and here I mean also there's a big responsibility with the Commission to actually work with the member states to present both sides of the story and both arguments to the member states that are willing to listen. Now, if there are member states that just feel that the enlargement has been a failure, and there are such, or political leadership in the member states that feels that the previous enlargements have been a failure, and that makes it not worth it to engage with the Western Balkans, and I think that's part of the argument that we should not forget to mention in this conversation, then I don't think that either of the two logics will actually be appealing to them, because there is political leadership in the member states that don't feel that either of the two logic is worth it to be engaged with the Western Balkans. But let's hope that this opinion will not prevail. And I think that this is a point that also Florian mentioned in terms of the rising authoritarian tendencies in some of the EU member states, which make it easier for others to actually argue that no matter what, there's no need to actually engage with these countries if it's on a purely geopolitical basis. So I think that this is one of the arguments that we need to also take into consideration, but also that shows us the need to engage with all of the member states, some of them which find the geopolitics and the other ones that find the conditionality as a more stable argument. Thomas, you're muted. You're still muted. Right?
You're still muted.
Thomas, you're muted. I'm tempted to come back on some of your points, colleagues, but I think we should respect our moderator.
I was going to offer a joke, but...
That's always difficult, Desmond. I found that problematic across borders.
True, yeah, exactly. Especially with the lag, right?
Nope.
Oh, there you go. You're unmuted, or can't hear you, but the little icon about muting is gone.
Yeah. No. Can you use the other one maybe? This usually happens to the speakers, but let's see.
I wanted to make you feel better, Simonida, because you were mentioning that, you know, given that you're in North Macedonia, you can't travel anywhere to the EU. I'm in the US and I can't do it either. So, you know,
you know, the restrictions are something which affect all of us, also us, in terms of being able to get out to the region.
Yeah. No.
Shall we make the break now and then?
Yeah, that might be a good idea.
Yeah. I think that's the, let's see.
Thomas, I've noted that your muting sign has come back on again. So you may be muted from your computer.
Or from a more powerful source.
Shall we take a break now? Yes. Yes. Or I'll put a question mark.
We can talk between each other, it's fine, yeah. Okay.
Oh, okay. Very good. Okay. So I believe I'm being asked here to speak about the protest movements in the region and how they relate to the conversation that we're having presently. So I think protest movements are, again, as I think I've said in a few of my comments now, I mean, they're a little bit of a double-edged sword. I mean, I do come out of a kind of milieu, and I am of the position that I think ultimately protest culture and protest politics is good. It is necessary. It's a healthy part of a democratic society, and you know, it's part ultimately of the democratic process. You know, one portion of it are free and fair elections, which are critical. The other part is a robust civil society, which includes free media, but also the right and ability to protest. I think, as I've noted, the issue that you know, I'm becoming more concerned about, and, you know, for the like three of you that might have read my book or seen some of my writing at some point, you know, I do always kind of acknowledge the fact that there is an edge to it, right? And when the turn towards street-based politics starts to come out of a place of not just anger. I mean, there's always an element of anger when people take to the streets, and there's constructive anger and dangerous anger. And I think what I'm concerned about is that, you know, we're starting to see more of that dangerous anger. We are starting to see rage. I kind of go back to the protests in Bosnia in 2014 as being in some ways a foreshadowing of a lot of the things that we've started seeing happening throughout the region since then. Because it was really those protests that introduced the specter of kind of violence, for lack of a better term, into street-based mobilizations. And we've seen different societies in the region flirting with various forms of violence and contestation and kind of challenging political authority. And we've also, you know, started seeing political regimes in the region push back against street-based mobilizations. I mean, we all watched the footage, for instance, out of Serbia a couple weeks and months ago after the elections there, and, you know, very, very serious footage, very alarming footage of police violence against peaceful protesters. This has become, unfortunately, I think, very, very common throughout the region. And it's only going to get worse, that kind of push-pull dynamic between kind of an increasingly disillusioned and angry street-based politics and this kind of recalcitrant, increasingly authoritarian political pushback, unless there is something to kind of cut the Gordian knot, as it were. Because the reality is, I mean, we have to understand where this is coming from. I mean, people do not want to live in these societies as they are presently constituted. I mean, that's to be very simple and almost simplistic, but that's essentially the issue. And this is, again, where historically something like the European Union and the United States and the broader international kind of project, the Euro-Atlantic project for the region, has been so important because it offered a horizon. It offered the promise of this is what you could be, this is what you could become. And, you know, Clive is absolutely right. It's a slow, tedious, generational, sometimes very technical process. And I think people understood that for a very, very long time, and they were willing to go along with it. I think, as Simonida has acknowledged, though, one of the fundamental disconnects that we're dealing with now in the year 2020 is that, you know, part of it is generational, as in there's new people coming up, new biological human beings coming up. But I think the fundamental issue is that we're not seeing the kind of sufficiently rapid change that people were expecting. We're still dealing with some really, really fundamental categorical issues for a lot of people in the region, and they're just no longer willing to wait. And so again, then we go back to that problem that we've already touched on. You get essentially two to three kinds of responses. One is that you leave. One is that you turn towards street-based mobilization, or three is that you essentially become part of the existing establishment, which is to say you become part of the patronage networks, you become part of the same illiberal and authoritarian tendencies. But the thing is, and I mean, I'll kind of finish on this point, you know, the thing is, this is an unsustainable system. The point at which we're at now is unsustainable, and it's going to rupture. It's going to break. The question for us and the thing to debate ultimately is, you know, how is going to rupture? What is that going to mean? And how can outside actors, but also those of us, you know, to one extent or another who are within these societies, how can we make sure that that rupture ultimately is constructive, or at the very least not completely destructive?
Okay, I'll thank you on behalf of Thomas because he can't speak right now. Yasmin, Thomas has asked me to come in on some questions related to COVID, which I'll do, but just allow me, Thomas, if you don't mind, just to come in one point that Yasmin made about the, if you like, and somehow the democratic legitimacy of protest. You know, of course, from the European Union point of view, it's a fundamental right. So, of course, we think it's important. No? I think there are really two provisos. One is that demonstrations need to remain peaceful. And two, I think, and this is important in the Balkans in particular, that they don't displace the democratic structures of the country. That they are not a political attempt to take debate out of parliament. Parliament is the place where finely honed processes allow the representation of the people's will to be implemented by politicians, and that structure is I mean, it's obvious to say that the functioning of parliament is key to democracy. So if street demonstrations are used as a way of weakening that, then that's not a good thing. And we've underlined that constantly in our messaging. Incidentally, on our messaging, I think our opening speaker spoke about silence. Frankly, I found that a little difficult to understand, you know, in the business that we are in our office, where every single morning we are responding to journalists on exactly the questions of the day. I mean, we're out there every day saying what the EU thinks about what's going on in the region, and we don't let up on that. Anyway, that's enough on those subjects. Christian, I would like to come back on what you actually asked me, which is to do with COVID and the reaction there. I think we actually, as a union, reacted very fast in terms of helping support the Western Balkans. I mean, it was a week or 10 days that the whole huge package was put together for the Western Balkans. And it is huge. I mean, it's more than 3 billion euros. The mechanisms for mobilizing what ultimately is European taxpayers' money are complicated and politically demanding. So to do that was incredible, frankly. I mean, and I mean that throughout all of the institutions of the EU, the fact that everyone was able to decide, okay, now this is important. The Western Balkans are very significant partners for us, and we want to make sure that they understand that and that we address COVID as well as we can immediately. And we really did that. When it came to some leaders in the region initially using rhetoric about others' support, I mean, I think it was rhetoric. It didn't reflect in any way at all what was actually being delivered on the ground, which was coming very, very strongly from the European Union. We've continued. I mean, every week we're making new deliveries, and we're involving the countries of the region in mechanisms which so far have just been for the use of member states of the European Union. They're doing more than ever using EU-based mechanisms to work together. Common procurement is one example. And that's only part of it. I mean, the biggest part of it in money terms is still to come with the investment package that the Commission is going to put forward together with the reports in October. And I mean, I think that's going to be critical because the economic effects, I mean, several colleagues have mentioned the economic effects of COVID. It is huge. It's huge for the European Union. It's huge for the region, which after all, you know, there is a big economic gradient between the Western Balkans and the European Union. Their economies are not yet competitive with those of the European Union. We'll go into extreme detail in the reports that will come out in a few weeks on all of that. But the bottom line is they need support. They also need to do something else, which is really, really key. And where, conversely, the COVID crisis actually pushed political leaders into action, which is on green lanes, to say, look, we've had enough of blockages on borders that get in the way of trade. In this case, it was for emergency stuff, but it also works and is very, very important for normal trade that countries do across borders. There are too many blocks, and the countries of the Western Balkans have agreed in principle to open up their borders with the regional economic area. There are an awful lot of commitments that have been made, and actually COVID has pushed the Western Balkan leaders to go forward on that and to do more. So I think, you know, one of the challenges now is to, if you'll bear with me 1 second, I have a highly secure laptop, which sometimes imposes security controls on me. If they can continue those measures and continue that dynamic of economic cooperation, that is also essential. You know, ultimately, the Western Balkans can only succeed economically if it breaks down barriers between the individual partners in the Western Balkans. So that's one of the things that the Western Balkans also needs to do in parallel with getting very substantial support from us. With all of those measures together, and we're strongly encouraging that economic integration. You'll see the Berlin Process Summit, which is going to take place in Skopje in the autumn. That itself will, I think, be a place to crystallize the work and the political commitment to taking down barriers to trade and economic development across the region. So COVID is a tough one. It's a tough one for all of us, but I really do think the European Union has done the maximum and is continuing to do the maximum to support the Western Balkans. Thomas, I'll leave it there. Sorry, Christian, I'll leave it there.
Simonida, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Yasmin. Sure. The hearts and the minds of the people, that's how the question was phrased, if not what has to change. I mean, the European Union, as in its member states, has not been ideal, to put it diplomatically. It has not been very good at communicating at times also what it does. And I think that despite all of the criticism that we have, that have been directed in this panel as well, and overall, it's for sure the biggest economic supporter of the region. I mean, that's something that, and that was the case also in the pandemic, despite a bit of, there was criticism at the outset. I don't think that we can, we also have to keep in mind that your question was raised also, is the EU supporting, getting the public support. I think there's at times discordances between what will be the government response and what will the government convey to the population in terms of the support that it gets from its various partners. And I think this was the most clear in Serbia that we saw during the pandemic. And then there were other countries, so I don't think we can generalize on this point, because the EU assistance has been instrumentalized in many ways. But I don't think that the public is, in most of the countries, I think that, and this was also, I don't think that the public is blind. I think that most of the majority of them are very well aware that the support that these countries get from the EU is substantial, and that the primary migration destination, as was mentioned before, is also the EU, despite some of the excursions and adventures with other actors. In any case, I don't think that the hearts and minds of the people of the region can be won solely by funds. Because these will be channeled mostly through the governments, and at times it will be very difficult to discern as to where they went. I mean, there's also here a responsibility on our side, or the civil society, to actually monitor where the funds go. But I think that ultimately the hearts and minds of the people will be won when these funds will be put into improving the institutions of the countries themselves, improving the services that these countries get. And this can also go, we can't disengage it from the EU accession process. I think it will be very difficult to disengage the funds that are channeled into the economic support from progress in the actual accession. I think in the best case scenario, this should happen at the same time, going back to where I started of the North Macedonia case. And I think it's a good case to be able to showcase that. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I mean, I should use this opportunity, I think, to perhaps clarify my stance more broadly. I think I've kind of come across as the very critical one of EU policy, and I am, but I say that as somebody who is genuinely committed to the European project. I wish for it to be better than it is in practice. That having been said, I think the COVID situation is a very interesting one. I actually think here the EU, from my perspective, has done a relatively good job. I think Clive's comments are taken very well taken, especially when we sort of think about the entire timeline of the spread of the pandemic, and both obviously how it affected the EU itself, you know, especially when we're thinking about our friends in places like Italy and Spain, and how what a hard time they had, and then still within that context being able to you know, provide a major relief package for the region. I think the framing around the issue of winning hearts and minds, though, is exactly the right one. And it is something that I think transcends the issue of COVID, whatever the future of, you know, our kind of global response to that will be. I think historically, the thing that the EU has struggled with is actually that process of winning hearts and minds. And again, at the risk of being a little bit kind of, I don't want to say facetious, but sometimes I think this is taken the wrong way, and I mean it very genuinely. A lot of this comes down to PR, and the European Union has bad PR in the Western Balkans, unfortunately, whereas countries like Russia and China have really good PR, right? They have a weak product, strong PR. The EU has an amazing product, terrible PR. Right, and you saw that very clearly in Serbia, with the whole kind of fiasco with the press conference with China. You know, every time that Russia sends, whether it's military hardware or, you know, a couple boxes of ventilators, it's a huge event. It's covered by all the media. You know, the president is there on the tarmac to greet it. And obviously I understand that the European Union is, I mean, for one thing, it's not a state, and it can't marshal the kind of, shall we say, streamlined resources and streamlined presentation that, you know, the Kremlin can, as it were. But I think there's a lot of work that can be done in terms of engaging the public. And, you know, I mean, to be quite blunt, again, to be a little bit cheeky, right? To say, like, to start actually aggressively countering some of these, you know, Kremlin-sponsored narratives, the sponsored narratives that come out of the CCP, right? These are things that should be confronted via social media, via local media, analog media, what have you, right? And actually also making it clear to you know, partners and would-be candidate states in the region that, like, look, we're not actually going to allow you to keep taking our money, our funds, our resources, and then in some cases literally repackaging them either as your own product or as the product that's coming from Russia, China, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I mean, I do think in this sense, you know, the European Union does deserve to expect to have its contributions acknowledged in this sense. And ultimately, and this is the final point that I'll say, I mean, look, this also fundamentally comes down to the big distinguishing marker between the European Union and Russia, China, et cetera, on the other hand. The fundamental truth that has remained unchanged for the duration of the last 2 decades is that citizens in the Western Balkans overwhelmingly either want to be part of the European Union in the context of their own countries and societies, or they want to move there, right? Nobody's lining up to move to China. Nobody's lining up to move to Russia. And that's a huge, huge thing. That's not a little thing. Right? And I think that is something that really, really needs to be emphasized more, the kind of, not just the kind of transformative potential that the European Union has, but the real kind of unassailable selling point is that people in this region want to be part of it. It's just working out that process of how that actually happens, right? And that's a huge thing. I'll finish there.
Thanks, Yasmin. Christian, if you allow, I just want to briefly come in on this one. Yasmin, you make very good points on this, and I think I would see things very much the same way. I think we have improved a great deal in terms of the strategic communication that we do, including the way in which we fight disinformation. You know, we have a whole team of people now doing this in Brussels. So I think we're moving in the right direction there. I think we are becoming more effective with our messaging. We are, of course, working within our own EU values. We like to tell the truth, which is something which distinguishes us from others in many contexts. So we need to work within those limits. But is there scope to do that even better? Yasmin, I would agree with you, and we're trying to do that. We're working more on that. Thank you.
So we will start with the last 30 minutes of Q&A with both our online participants and everybody here in the room. And I will do it the same way as Thomas did it before. We will mix questions a bit, and I would open the floor for people in the audience here in Lockham to make comments, and I will add online comments to this. So who would like to make the start and make a comment or a question? Okay, so everybody's still warming up, it seems. I will actually start with a question from the audience, which is, I would say, for Jasmine, where Adrian Hatschkai asks, in what way can the EU work with the citizens of the Western Balkans, and what can be concrete and innovative initiatives? What would be your answer, Jasmine?
So two things, I would say. One thing is to expand the existing civil society monitoring mechanisms that have already been implemented for a number of years now, bringing in those non-governmental organizations, but also various other kinds of civic associations, including those that don't necessarily have the kind of professional look that a lot of, essentially professional NGOs do have. We've started seeing over the last few years a number of what I would essentially call civic assemblies, even things like neighborhood councils beginning to gain greater, I would say, input and currency in terms of how they sort of engage with local municipalities, local communities, et cetera, et cetera. Those are voices and practices that that the European Union should actively be seen to be elevating and incorporating in some fashion. Related to that, I would also really love to see just a kind of broader spectrum of public engagement across the region when we're talking about fora, when we're talking about platforms, when we're talking about engaging with media. It's fantastic that, various kinds of EU special representatives, for instance, such as in Bosnia, are, relatively frequent commodities on local chat shows and what have you. That's great, but that's still a kind of one-way dialogue. And we've seen that long enough. What we need to see more of is actually debate for different kinds of platforms for citizens actually to be able to voice their perspectives, and also very importantly, I think their grievances. When we're talking about, in the long run, how it is that you actually deal with kind of, we're talking about cutting that Gordian knot of a kind of growing sense of frustration, anger, and rage on the part of many ordinary citizens. I think one of the simplest and easiest ways that you interrupt that process is by listening to people. And the amazing power of listening, to be quite cynical, but I say this as somebody who has 2 young children, is if you just listen to them, you don't necessarily have to do what they tell you to do. Right? You don't have to always do what you're hearing people say, because sometimes some ideas are just not feasible. But it actually does matter that you give them the opportunity to say that. And it also then gives you an opportunity to have a dialogue with them, to say like, okay, right, so I'm hearing where that's coming from. I'm hearing the frustrations. I think, 1, 2, 3 are what's underlying those frustrations. Here's what we think we can do. How does this sound to you? Does this sound like something, we can meet each other halfway on? And I think finally, the really important thing about doing that is that is also another thing that the EU can do that local governments, by and large, are not doing. Right? This is, again, another one of those moments where you're modeling good behavior. The EU can be seen as modeling democratic participation, democratic transparency, democratic accountability, by saying, look, we're not perfect. We want to hear from you. We want to learn from you. What do you like that we're doing? What do you don't like that we're doing? And hey, maybe think about the fact that we're giving you this opportunity to have this conversation with us, where perhaps your local governments are not, and maybe you should start to expect that. Right? Maybe you should start expecting actually that local political leaders are going to organize fora, are going to organize platforms, are going to allow themselves to have their kind of feet held to the fire, as it were. Again, I think it's a simple thing. It's a cheap thing to do, very importantly, but it's a big, big impact thing.
And also some kind of socializing process, if I understand you correctly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I just chip in, Christian?
Sorry?
Can I just comment for a moment?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
I was just wanted to address you. What do you think, Simonida?
I think that, I like Yasmin's point. Although I'm not fairly certain that it's at times feasible in order for the EU to fix the participative democracy. But I wanted to go back to Ardian's questions from a different perspective, because it's not just the citizens. I think that the EU has still maintained, as it did in the previous enlargement, a large focus on the executive. And I think that going back to the last word that you mentioned, socialization, I think that there is an increasing scope to work with other branches of power as well, to work with parliaments, to work with the judiciary for the sake of empowering. And I'm saying this because the EU engagement with them on various levels also has a legitimizing role in these societies in terms of the power that these actors obtain. And I think this has been an argument brought up also more recently in literature by various authors, but we've seen it in practice, although of course the primary interlocutor is the government. We do see a weak link in terms of involving other branches of power and their role in the process. And I think this has been a perpetual problems of reforming also the judiciary, problems that we're going to see coming up now with the new methodology in terms of functioning of democratic institutions, in terms of the role of parliament. If we go back to 2018, one of the documents of the Juncker Commission was the enhanced strategy for more credible enlargement process. And I think here, just as we've heard in several occasions, there were some attempts to actually involve more parliamentarians and also to involve representatives in the EU processes, be it the parliament, be it some of the various council bodies. And I think that we also need to work on these people-to-people engagements in various aspects, besides, leaving the citizens moment to what was discussed before.
So not only focus on the people, but also focus on the people's representatives, because so far there's a very strong executive focus.
Yes, the executive focus has been very much and we've seen it in these processes. It has been one of the weaker links of the process.
Yeah. So before we continue, we have an intervention by Adelaide Wölfel.
Yeah, I have a question to Simonida. Actually, I wanted to know about the reform plans when it comes to the rule of law in North Macedonia. Do you have a roadmap? Which parts and how the judiciary or the police should be reformed? Will there be a vetting process or something like that? And until when you want to achieve? And then I also wanted to ask you, we talked about that most of the European Union members don't want to have another Hungary or another like authoritarian regime within the EU, but we also have the example of Bulgaria. We have a state inside the European Union where there is a huge lack of rule of law. So how can you persuade the other EU member states that they are willing to welcome a new member and that this new member will not become another Hungary or not another Bulgaria?
Thank you.
And we will. Huh?
Yeah.
Okay, Simonida, please.
Oh, do you want to take a couple? I'm sorry.
The floor is yours, Simonida.
Thank you.
Yes,
yes, specifically on, and I think I'll put a different hat now in terms of if we are looking specifically at the case of North Macedonia, it's in the region, the country that implemented first some of the major judicial reforms that are being comparably discussed now in Serbia and also in other countries in terms of the instituting a single point of entry, such as the Academy for Judiciary, strengthening the judicial independence back in 2005. And this basically gives the country a head start in terms of the accession negotiations, and in terms of the rule of law reforms. Now, the question is that the question that begs is always if the country implemented some of the models together with the European Commission and we ended up where we did in 2015, is it the models that are problematic? Is it the implementation at the local, at the national level? But even if we take a look at most of the European assessments, and this is the country where the first PRIBE reports were implemented that were also mentioned by Florian previously in the opening lecture, even from the European counterparts and the European experts, the state of rule of law in the country, and specifically in terms of the judicial reform, has not been assessed as bad, let's put it that way. It's still the judicial reform in the country and the state of the independence of the judiciary has never been questioned to a level comparable to other countries that have implemented the vetting process, let's say. And vetting was never, for example, because you specifically asked that question, was never recommended by European counterparts, by experts from peer missions. And my organization has been doing a lot of discussions for the last year together with the judiciary and with regional experts, with regional counterparts, specifically from Albania and other countries, to discuss whether such a model would be necessary. I don't think that, I mean, vetting in the traditional way that we see it has not been promised. The new government did promise in the first 100 days to go through a process of checking the assets of the judges, but we'll see how much will this take place. You mentioned specifically roadmap. The unfortunate moment that we have in terms of a very pro-European government is that actually we are at and awaiting for the accession negotiations, is that we are now in a phase of waiting for a roadmap from the Commission in view of starting the accession negotiations. Most of the previous commitments, given that this is the first start of the government, most of the previous commitments have been completed. And we are at a phase at which the government, together with the European Commission, needs to agree on the key benchmarks in this respect for the first cluster of fundamentals. Going back to where the judiciary reform stands. Going back to your question on sustainability, I don't think that there will be, I think this is a question that begs a lot of thinking also on the side of the European Commission, but also the national authorities, because, and that's why I started with the fact that the country did implement some of the judicial reforms first, because I don't think that we will ever have a guarantee of sustainability. But I think that the recipes for sustainability have to come from within, from the national level. They have to come through a consensus of the stakeholders here. They can't come through any form of an imposed or any form of a transferred solution from either of the experts from the EU member states that will come, because most of the EU countries have different traditions, have different systems in this respect. And I think that supporting the national stakeholders through the accession process to work towards sustainable rule of law reforms will be essential, because one of the pitfalls here, and someone who works on Macedonia for a long time, has been also indiscriminate use of some of the models that exist in the member states. And I think that we are at a certain point, at a point in time in which we have to find our own recipe for sustainability through the European Union accession process. But going back to your question, if we take a look at the record of the country, the wiretap crisis has been a blow to the judiciary. But even after that crisis, most of the European experts that did come here did say that there is an issue with a corrupt, possibly 5 to 10% of the judges, and these are basically words from the previous reports, but that most of the judiciary actually operates fairly well. Now, the question is whether the judiciary will find a mechanism to cleanse those 5 to 10% that have possibly subverted some of the politically prominent cases that we've seen recently.
So a very honest answer, there is not really a guarantee for the sustainability, of course. And Tobias.
Yeah, okay, thank you,
The next
Christian.
on the list.
Thank you, Clive. Sorry, thank you, Simonida. It would be lovely to have you here. And it's completely different if we were in one room. Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Clive. Same for you. I think dialogue and also European integration can only happen if you're actually in one room and debate, because it's a bit like watching TV and having the way of a little bit of a way of participating in a TV show. But having said this, I'd like to develop a quick thought, and then that will be with a question. Basically, I think we should look a bit more long term. And if you look at the relationship between the European Union and the region we are talking about, we're not looking at something which has started 30 years ago. We're looking at something that has started around 60 years ago, and there have been agreements and discussions back in the 60s and in the 70s, financing mechanism, stability, the return of the guest workers, which will be very similar probably to the return of the workers who are currently here in the EU and have to return after the COVID crisis. So there are a lot of things that which we can look and which we can have a more reflection about. And that includes also the whole question of data and statistics. I work, as some of you may know, in Serbia, working for the Council of Europe, and I'm not speaking here on behalf of the Council of Europe, but just what I notice is that data and statistics is a very crucial issue. None of the states are actually really having reliable data and statistics. It starts with issues related to voter registers and who is on them and who isn't. So this is anographic data, very simple, you know, who is there and who isn't. Not that simple sometimes, but then it goes back over to statistics about, you know, economic growth, investment, etc. But what we saw in the COVID crisis, for instance, the Prime Minister of Serbia said that they had problems with databases of counting cases, etc. So I think there should be something done there. And that is also related, obviously, to the economic data with regard to value-added tax. And now working in Serbia, I can only confirm that we are not having a value-added tax system, and that will be the question to the EU, of course, that is not in line with the Stabilization and Association Agreement. There's no value-added tax number in line with European standards, and this is actually very bizarre. Why can you be so far in the integration process and have not got an aligned value-added tax system, which is so important for small business and also for you know, the rule of law in terms of being sure that you're always on the right side of the law with your value-added tax. And that is then related as well, if you look at the broader question of statistics and data, to what is going to happen in the census year 2021. As you know, censuses have been very controversial in the region for many years. And my question is, couldn't the EU here, in a what next kind of attitude, become much more proactive and say, because of the low level of trust and the low level of capacity in these states to do these kind of things, or a combination of both, some have been advancing with statistics, but some are lacking, couldn't there be a much more forceful action in saying, look, we are taking this kind of responsibility on our shoulders in order to avoid exactly the kind of mistrust that these kind of exercises usually have, and that are actually putting people back. And I'm looking here, for instance, at a case study at Montenegro, because if there is government change now, there's a census year, and the government change is very much about nationality questions. Census may become extremely sensitive. So 2 questions, one about value-added tax, and one about could the EU not do more about statistics and data and become maybe more executive in this field until systems become more reliable?
So Clive, this is for you.
Cool. Thank you very much. Interesting questions. I'll start with the value-added tax one. I mean, that's a question of technical alignment with the acquis, and that's, I mean, the mechanism there, as you know, is that the country that's negotiating can only close the chapter when it's aligned. So, I mean, you know, that's a pretty strict condition. So, you know, clearly any country negotiating is going to have to fulfill that. And if they haven't yet, they will do in order to close that chapter. That's how the logic of the accession negotiations works. Of course, none of the countries, neither of the 2 countries which are currently in the negotiation process have closed all of the chapters. So, you know, it's natural that some of the things they haven't done yet, but of course they will have to do those things.
You know that interestingly others have, who are not negotiating.
Well, they may well have, and they, of course, they're free to do that for their own internal policy reasons. I think that raises an interesting question and an interesting aspect of the European integration process, which is that, of course, the reason that the European Union does things in certain ways and in line with certain laws is that we together, with an awful lot of experience, have decided that that's actually the best way to do them. So beyond it being the way the European Union does it, we also think it's a good way to do it. So more broadly, we encourage the countries to do reforms they need to do, not just to progress on their European Union path, but because actually that will help governments deliver better to their citizens. So, I mean, I think that partly reflects your question. So the answer is relatively straightforward. Any country will have to fulfill the requirements of the EU acquis on that to close the relevant chapter in the accession negotiations. Now on censuses, you argue for a more interventionist approach, essentially. I think there are 2 things here. The first one is you're positing an approach from the European Union where we do it essentially on behalf of the countries. Huh? You said take it on your shoulders. I think that's problematic because the ownership aspect is extremely important. As you rightly said, censuses are in many cases, very sensitive. And because of that, the countries themselves and the citizens of those countries need to have trust in it. But it needs to be something that the countries themselves generate, and the trust that the countries themselves earn is important here. Ultimately, it's not healthy for the European Union to do that on behalf of other countries. What we do though, and it's not for the first time. I mean, this is something that we've done quite a bit of in the past, and in past censuses, is to help a lot, to provide a great deal of assistance. The European Union, being what it is, has extremely well-developed expertise on statistics in Eurostat. And the EU has not hesitated to bring to bear that expertise to help streamline systems and make them function better so that the country's own census arrangements work better and more effectively and can fulfill that trust that the citizens have in their own organizations to come up with reliable and trustworthy figures. So I would fully agree with you on the importance of it, but I would stress the ownership of the countries themselves in doing that work. And again, we are fully committed to helping wherever we can and wherever necessary in that process.
Thank you for this. We have a last round of questions, which actually come from the online audience. And the first question goes to Simonida. And the And Phillips asks, does the participation of many EU member states and the Western Balkans in China's Belt and Road Initiative dilute EU cohesion and EU importance to the Western Balkans? So what role does it play that so many countries are taking part in China's Belt and Road Initiative and China's general initiative for Central and Eastern Europe, I guess?
Yep. I don't think that we need to see necessarily other actors' engagement as a way of diluting EU's cohesion, especially because, as was mentioned also in the question, there are EU member states that participate in it. So I don't think that in this way, the Balkans cannot be more, as we say, more Catholic than the Pope. And for us to expect that there would be no other engagement of other actors with the region. I think that the question arises, and most people that would work on Chinese engagement in the region would still argue that the engagement is in the future of, in view of the Balkans membership in the European Union itself. So at this point, I don't see it that much as a diluting of cohesion factor that we've seen. I think that there are other forms of lack of cohesion within the European Union that are much more threatening to the Balkans at this point, such as the discordance on the rule of law matters, discordance on the positions that some of the EU member states have had towards authoritarian tendencies in the region. One of the core elements that was affected detrimentally the cohesion or the democratizing role of the EU in the region was the refugee/migration crisis and the positions, the discordance within the European Union on this matter. So I think there are much more pressing issues and there's much more dissonance between the EU member states that has harmed the EU cohesion in the region than specifically the participation in the initiative that was mentioned.
Perhaps one point, Christoph, if I may, on this one. I think it's worth keeping in mind what's the logic behind reinforcing infrastructure that can carry trade between Russia and the European Union. That's a very strong acknowledgement of the global force and power of the European Union as the world's biggest trading bloc. That's the reason why China wants to put in place that kind of infrastructure. So in some ways, it's an acknowledgement of our predominance globally in that respect, and I think that's reflected ultimately in the reality that the Western Balkans live in. They are their economic links with the European Union are by far the most important ones. We are over 90% of the trade of the Western Balkans countries. And that's ultimately important also politically, because it means that it's by integrating into the European Union that families individually can see a future for their own next generation, jobs, prosperity. So that economic weight and the economic links between the Western Balkans and the European Union that are ironically underlined by the amount of energy that China is putting in, are ultimately arguments for integration and part of the mechanism of that integration.
I want to just very quickly jump in on that point, because I think it's important, because also going back to something Clive was noting earlier in a discussion we had earlier about geopolitics, I think it's very important that we be sober about the intentions of China in spreading the One Belt, One Road project to the Western Balkans and actually front loading the Western Balkans so prominently in the context of that project. I think it's critical that we understand that this is fundamentally a strategic and geopolitical project for China and not an economic one. And I'll be very transparent about where I'm coming from. You know, I have Taiwanese family, and so we're in an interesting household where, you know, we're watching what's going on in Hong Kong. We're looking at what's happening in the South China Sea. We're looking at what's happening in Taiwan, and I'm very worried about the future of China in the Western Balkans. I mean, they've already set up essentially a debt trap for Montenegro. It's a model that they are exporting to the rest of the region. I mean, the largest post-war investment in Bosnia, single largest investment in post-war Bosnia has come from China. Right. So in terms of a single project, it doesn't match obviously the overall contributions of the EU and the US, but this is important. This really, really matters. And these countries can't sustain the kind of model of engagement that China is offering them. And I think, especially when we're talking about the process of EU integration and very importantly, NATO integration, this is raising some really profound, I think, existential questions for Europe and the entire Atlantic community. When you start talking about countries like Montenegro falling into debt dependency to China, who are also NATO member states. So I think this is a question that needs to be unpackaged a lot more thoroughly, rather than strictly sort of through kind of the economic lens, although Clive's points are obviously well taken in that sense.
So you say that it's not so important. It's not so important that building roads for joint or mutual trade interests, but rather that the infrastructure will ultimately belong to China.
Right. Yeah. I think that's the fear, and also the kind of the trickle down effect that is going to have on not just the kind of political economic stability of these countries, but also how it's going to shape the relationship between these countries and the Atlantic community, the European community, etc.
Maybe linked to this, Mr. Rumble, there was a question put directly for you that you mentioned shared security interests of the region and the EU, and that asked you to elaborate on these shared security interests.
Well, I mean, they stem from geography ultimately, because the Western Balkans are, surrounded by member states of the European Union. Clearly, security elements which affect them are going to have a knock-on security effect for the European Union. So, if we look at rule of law, why is rule of law so thoroughly underlined always in our interaction with the Western Balkans? Well, it's because strengthening that has a direct effect on our own interests in the European Union. Counterterrorism is another field where we've been working very hard with the Western Balkans to improve the way that they work with us, the way that they work domestically, and the way they work with each other. Because it's only in that way that we can have a region which is, geographically within the European Union, secure. Aspects like that, I think, simply by virtue of the geography also affect us, and so we have joint shared interests. Migration is a separate issue. I won't deal with it as a security issue as such, but since it was raised, clearly the geography also means that if there are migrants wishing to go to the European Union, they are in many cases going to go via the Western Balkans, and so our cooperation with the Western Balkans is extremely important in that respect.
Thank you. So we will have a final round now, and we have one question from the audience here and one final question from the online audience. So Siddharth Tripathi, you have the floor.
Yeah, just it's a sort of addition to what Yasmin said about role of China. I mean, they don't have to go far. I mean, they can take the example of South Asia. I mean, I think EU is really a bit more confident about its economic weight in the Balkans. I mean, India was also at some point talking about its neighbors, surrounding, and we had shared historical, linkages and shared historical cultures. But I mean, look at what China is doing in South Asia. And I guess that can be a very good example for what it can do in the Balkans also. So maybe an eye opener for you here.
Okay, so to have a more critical view on it by comparing to other regions in the world where China is also acting.
Yeah, I think, from the point of view of the European Union, I work for the External Action Service, and of course, we do have a global remit, so we're very much, looking at how China is acting elsewhere, and we have that in mind too when we're considering policy in the Balkans.
I think it's also, I mean, at this point, just to kind of take up our colleague's point there, which I think is very well taken, especially when you're thinking about something like what China has done in Sri Lanka. And I think that very much being the model that we're all concerned about vis-a-vis Montenegro and the whole region. I think the reality is, I honestly feel like we've gone from like 0 to 100 in how we talk about China very, very quickly. And I think ultimately that's good, because I think we need to be sober about the security and political challenges that the world's most populous authoritarian state represents for global democracy. I mean, let's be quite blunt. But the other aspect of this is that I think we are still playing a little bit of catch up. I mean, China has been slowly building its political infrastructure in the region for much of the last decade. In fact, a little bit longer than that. I mean, I know very well when I started sort of seeing the first kind of overt presentations by the Chinese embassy in Sarajevo and being like, you know, where is this coming from? The opening of Confucius Institutes and all of this kind of stuff, right? So in this sense, I think, you know, the European Union, unfortunately, is playing a little bit of catch up, but realistically, so are we all when I kind of talk about a global community of democracies, right? I mean, I think we are, unfortunately, in a moment where we're sort of living through an accelerated moment in history. But on the flip side, I think it has opened everybody's eyes to the fact that, you know, the European project has competitors. It has challengers, and kind of the broader, you know, Atlantic democratic project also has competitors. And I think that's how we need to start thinking about it. I don't expect, nor do I believe it's possible for the European Union to become a geopolitical player in the same way that, again, a kind of sovereign state can be, or that it even should move in that model. But I do think that we have to be a little bit more strategic in how we engage in this region. You know, I'm thankful that the discourse of you know, the only game in town that European policymakers once upon a time were very prone to using, that has essentially evaporated. But there has to be a real kind of lessons learned, a stock-taking exercise. You know, what kind of damage was done by actors like Russia and China, for instance, as well as local states in particular. Here I would highlight Serbia, unfortunately. What kind of damage was done to kind of the actual strategic structure of the region and the democratic institutions in the region during that long period in which essentially European policymakers were not willing to acknowledge the reality that was playing out in front of us, and how that can inform future policymaking.
If I just may, Christian, I mean, on that point, I think that this strategic thinking will be very difficult to make from the positions of some of, because this is a similar position in which some of the EU member states are. Because you mentioned, I mean, Croatia. So you have the peer in Greece. So, I mean, it's not, that's why I was mentioning that, that's why I started with being more Catholic than the Pope, because I think it will be very difficult to reflect on this issue in the way that you mentioned it, because some of the EU member states are even in a worse position in terms of the Western Balkans. So I think it's going to be very challenging in this respect.
So we have a final round of questions. There are two questions left from the audience that I would like to place here, and one is by Norbert Klein, and he says, how do you see the social partners, and particularly trade unions, in the enlargement process, and in which way methods of social dialogue can be used in this process? So could social partners in the Western Balkans be more involved in the enlargement process? And the second question focuses again on the external actors point, and asks whether the engagement of Russia and China has changed people's view on democracy and their view on democratic values. So Simonida, maybe you would like to start for the final round, and then we continue with Clive and Yasmin.
Sure. The social partners are, I'm not going to say incredibly, but rather weak in the region on the side of workers' unions and so on. And this has been a challenge in most of the region that, for example, I know that the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung has worked with, to go back to some of the social dimensions of the EU in accession and enlargement process that we've kind of missed in the neoliberal approach that most of that was employed in most of these countries. I think that once we come to the actual accession negotiations, if we want to talk about an effective enlargement and negotiations process, this will also mean an engagement with the trade unions and more broadly the social partners, because with the objective of actually the process gaining some much needed legitimacy, going back some of the discussions that we had before in terms of the executive capture and how do we bring the public on board. This brings a large portion of the public on board. But unfortunately, in most of these societies which have been labeled as state capture systems, it has been very difficult to have a voice for the social partners, and this will also mean and I think that this possibly we've missed it in the response to the EU questions, because I think that one of the engagement that the EU would be beneficial to do would be with the social partners, because this has been a rather neglected element of the accession process itself so far. I mean, there were various exercises such as the Economic and Social Committee and so on and so forth, but I think it takes a more institutionalized approach. This also will depend, for example, from where I stand in a country that's currently creating its negotiating structure for the EU accession. This will also depend on how the government will decide to engage with the rest of the stakeholders in the society in the EU accession process. There's a lot of raised expectations. We've not seen the light of day of many of these initiatives, but we'll see how this will play out. While this is the government's responsibility, there's also always the moment that the European Commission could also recommend and could request that other partners are more taken on board than in some of the other countries, than was the case in some of the other countries. Democratic values and has engagement of Russia and China actually disillusioned the public. I think that the public, going back to where we discussed, I think that the public is primarily disillusioned with the state of play of democracies in the region per se. It does not always take an external actor to support this form of disillusionment. There's various, while as Yasmin was mentioning, there's various forms of civil engagement, sometimes uncivil society. We also have a trend of young people at times, and in most of the countries, also holding very much conservative values because of the situation in which they grew up in the last 20 years, because of growing up in authoritarian societies. So it doesn't always take an external actor to do this. The engagement, as was also mentioned before, of Russia and China often plays on the fact that the EU is weak, or the EU has had its difficulties in coming up with a position, ineffective. So you see, it might be more preferential to have an authoritarian system or so on, to put it in a very simple manner. But I don't think that the effect on the public would be that much in terms of disillusionment with democratic values, because I think that's the responsibility of the local elites much more than of external actors.
Thank you. I think that the keyword is probably outcome legitimacy, if I understand it correctly, what the person asking the question meant. So are democratic actors weak, looking weak in comparison to Chinese actors who get things done, probably, or who have better PR than, as Jasmine said it earlier? Clive, what do you think?
I think that, I mean, you know, it's what Yasmin said. If you have, you know, a single line of command, you can do PR pretty effectively. Yasmin said that convincingly earlier on. But I do think that, you know, I've served on the ground in the Balkans for 8 years. So, I mean, I think I have, you know, some idea of what, you know, normal people think and then what their expectations are of their leaders. Their elected representatives. They have their own strong ideas and expectations about democracy, actually, and I think those are strong enough to withstand other actors coming in and saying, you know, who are not quite so focused on democracy, because I think people understand that their countries are different from those countries, and they have their own strong expectations. So I don't see them thinking that their country can afford to be less democratic just because some other country in another part of the world is less democratic. They still want that democracy, and they expect that democracy. And even, I mean, this goes to what Yasmin said earlier, even when that's not consistently delivered, even when there are issues, and of course there are. I mean, we spend actually a lot of our political energy on things like electoral reform in the country's media freedom. It's something we emphasize hugely and provide enormous amounts of support. It's very difficult, and we've got a long way to go. Although I would note Albania's progress on electoral reform recently. I think that's an important step forward. But the fact that we place so much emphasis on that, I think, is also a message to the public, and one that resonates strongly with them. They want high democratic standards, and I don't think they are inclined to let their leaders off lightly because other global actors have less emphasis on that.
I wanted to just very quickly jump on that and maybe tie it together with a theme that we've touched on a few times, but I don't think really unpackaged, and that's the question of migration. And it's interesting to me that we have tended to, for whatever strange reason, and I don't understand, and academics do the same thing, we talk about migration and the diaspora as two separate things, as though migration has not been a phenomenon in this region for the better part of nearly, not just 3 decades, to Tobias's point earlier. This is something that we've been dealing with for better part of more than a century. I think it's important that we recognize diaspora communities in Europe and elsewhere from the region as still, unfortunately, a largely untapped resource. It's a resource that has tremendous economic potential. It's also, however, a community that has tremendous political capacities and political potential. And when we're thinking about creating credible processes and credible frameworks in the region, this is again where I think the diaspora has a long way to go in terms of reintegrating itself in these processes, but also how it can serve as a tremendous reservoir of legitimacy and participation. And I'm thinking in particular about sort of folks my age. I'm in my early 30s, but I'm in touch with a lot of students and what have you. I nearly every week I'm talking to kids from Serbia, I'm talking to kids from Albania, I'm talking to kids from Kosovo, originally who are, in places like the Netherlands, Canada, US, Germany, et cetera, et cetera. In some cases, they don't speak the local languages even, but they have this tremendous interest and passion for somehow helping, somehow being engaged, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we need to get together a little bit more and really talk about how we can integrate their energy, their passion, and their interest, because I think there really are avenues for that. And it's also something that I think really gets to the core of one of the major issues and one of the major concerns that people in the region and also people in Europe have, right? We know that in certain capitals like The Hague, like Paris, even Berlin, migration is a threat, it's a concern. And there is the fear that if you integrate these countries further, if you allow them into the union, you're essentially going to see a mass population transfer. And I think one of the important things about incorporating the voices and the experiences and the expertise of the diaspora communities is to actually show that, well, not really, because the linkage between the diaspora and local communities has remained remarkably robust. Even, for instance, for families like my own who left at the beginning of the Bosnian War. All of us in my family, sans pandemic right now, we're in the region 2, 3, 4 times a year, in my case, certainly, right? And so those connections continue. There's a lot of money changing hands all the time. You're supporting people, you're investing things, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's not a one-way transfer. It's not like that people suddenly leave and they're just kind of completely detached, et cetera, et cetera. It's all to say that there's, I think, very comprehensive and robust economic and social mechanisms that can be strengthened and employed when we're thinking about the diaspora, and it can serve to assuage a lot of the fears and concerns that exist at both the European level and I think at the regional level. And it's something that I think, hopefully in the next few years we'll spend a lot more time talking about, because it has a lot of potential.
I would like to come in and add one point on that. We have a program.
A very brief final statement.
Very brief one, okay? Just to add to that point. We have a program called Erasmus, which sends students from the Western Balkans to European Union universities. And the point there is that they get educated and then they come back, they bring that back. And I think that's hugely beneficial. It goes, I think, in the same direction as what Yasmin said. So I think that's one way we can help a lot.
Okay, so just to add to this from my side, thank you for bringing up the issue of migration. We're going to pick up on this from our organization together with our partner. Southeast Europe Association together with the Aspen Institute to organize a conference on migration in the realm of the EU Council presidency of Germany. So if you're interested in this issue, to the entire audience and would like to be updated, just send us an email to Southeast Europe Association and we will keep you posted on this conference, which will also be in parts online accessible. So for now, I think we've crossed a tremendous number of issues today and had an interesting discussion here with our panel. And I would like to thank you all for joining this debate, for taking this experiment with us, and for bearing with us also through the difficult times of speechlessness and other issues we've encountered. So I hope you will bear with us also for tomorrow for the public part that will be also available for everyone. And for now, thank you very much for which will be
2 o'clock tomorrow.
At 2 o'clock tomorrow, and it will be the same link that was provided to everyone. Okay, so you can just access the discussion to the same link. Okay, it will be 2:30. So thank you to all the panelists for discussing with us today. Thank you to the audience and see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.